Hello everybody, and welcome. Today I'm going to be going over a melee Deathwalker build guide. So I'm not going to be talking about the mechanics of the class really or anything here like that. This is assuming you know how the class functions, and instead I'm just going to be going over how I build a melee Deathwalker. So Deathwalker is one of my two favorite starting classes in Frosthaven. I really enjoy it. I think I actually prefer the melee build personally. I think, I mean, both builds are obviously very competitive. I don't think one build is actually stronger than the other. And I think, in fact, people might be happier to have a ranged Deathwalker than a melee Deathwalker in their party, just because they'll be happy to have like a ranged attacker who can kind of hit anything. But I find that like the melee build sort of has higher risk, higher difficulty, but also sort of higher reward. I mean, you get to do a ton of damage. I think it's probably, of Frosthaven starters at least, the highest single target damage dealer in Frosthaven starters. So yeah, I think it's really fun, and I'm just going to go quickly, well, or relatively quickly, over how I would build it today. So the first thing we have to do is take a look at the level 1 cards. So at level 1, we're not going to be able to go completely melee. Instead, we're going to be sort of a hybrid of melee and range, and then we're going to build into being more or less completely melee in a few levels. So what is the real selling point at level 1 of being melee? Well, it is Strength of the Abyss. So Strength of the Abyss is going to attack X+1, where X is the number of shadows on the map. So obviously this is a non-loss attack 6, which is repeatable at level 1, which is obviously insane. That being said, it requires a lot of effort to get there, and it requires something very specific from us, which is trying to avoid spending many shadows. So basically, if we do a ranged build at level 1, what we're typically going to be doing a lot is using Fluid Knight, which is an attack 5, but sort of, even if we kill an enemy or that enemy later dies, we're giving up that shadow, so we're never netting shadows. Instead, we're going to try to make attack 6s with Strength of the Abyss, and not spend, like, we're going to try to get to 6 shadows, or 5 shadows to get to this and attack 6, and try to repeat this without really spending many shadows. And obviously the upside of that is, like, so this requires us moving a shadow, whereas this is just us moving. It's a little bit easier at level 1 to move us than shadows. I mean, it depends. It kind of varies. Both are kind of similar for different reasons, or competitive for different reasons. So anyway, let's take a look at what we would want for our level 1 cards for a melee build. So neither have Anger of the Dead is particularly good for us, because we don't want to spend a bunch of shadows at all, really. That being said, it's just 14 initiatives. This card is fine. Shadow Step is obviously seems very good. It's actually not as good as it seems at level 1, although it's still fine. Shadow Step really gets better later on, although it's still quite decent. Even just being an attack 3 at 19 initiative is fine. The bottom is also okay in some situations. So Shadow Step is obviously pretty good. Fluid Knight, I mean, is still going to be fine at level 1. It is still non-loss attack 5 as well, which kind of like already puts us to where we want to be with Strength of the Abyss. Not quite as good as Strength of the Abyss once we are fully powered, but doesn't require powering up as much. So you will kind of end up having to use this a bit, probably early in scenarios if your party needs the help, but you want to avoid using this too much. And theoretically, the bottom seems like it would be good for the melee build. Again, it can be once we get to 6 shadows if we don't have anything else to do, because it's sort of like a free disarm. But to do with the excess shadows. That being said, we're just not going to want to use this card too much in general because it has a very higher cost for the melee build than the range build. Rest in the Shade, again, is sort of a party-dependent card and isn't something we're really looking to use. Our goal is more just to focus on dealing damage. We have so many cards that we want to play, so this isn't, neither half is really appealing to us there. This not super great for us either, as we're going to be in relatively close range most of the scenario. We don't really care too much about having a long-range attack, and moving shadows is going to be important, but this isn't exactly how we want to do this, and I'll kind of get into that in a second. Call of Doom, the top, obviously not really appealing to us at all. We're looking to do a lot more damage. The bottom, however, just to move through Great Dark is actually going to be reasonably useful, not because of Black Barrage, but actually because of Forceful Spirits. So Forceful Spirits being with Dark and attack 3, target 2, range 2 is actually great, especially since as we're going to be playing more melee, we're often going to be close enough to hit 2 enemies. Like, the range build doesn't always have to move so much, so it can be harder to pull this off, whereas we can consistently get this, which is another form of a non-loss attack 6 level 1. So the combination of these two cards is actually really important to us for this bottom and this top. The range build is going to lean a lot more heavily on teleporting to hexes with shadows to move through the map, but because we're going to constantly be moving so that we are in range to do things like Forceful Spirits and Strength of the Abyss, this is going to be a little less important to us, although we'll still keep one of these effects around. Dark Fog, I mean, again, the loss is just fine for any build. It doesn't really matter. You can play this loss if you feel the need to. The bottom, again, is worse for us than the range build, but is actually still going to be kind of important, and I'll show you why. So the thing that we're going to do a lot with this at level 1, which is why this is better than this, actually, is because we don't really care where all of our shadows are so much on this build. We only care really where one shadow is. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I mean, once we get a perk or a couple perks and our level 2 card, we're going to want to try to occupy shadows more or less as much as we can while in combat. or occupy hexes containing shadows. But also, like, so the ranged build wants a bunch of shadows nearby for things like Anger of the Dead or Vengeful Storm. It cares about the positioning kind of all the shadows. We don't really have stuff in this build that cares so much about that because we're the one attacking, not our shadows attacking. So we really just need kind of one shadow where we care about until we get to level 3, and then we care a little bit more. But, well, we'll cross that bridge. So accordingly, the combo we're going to do a lot with Dark Fog is to use Dark Fog bottom plus Shadow Step top. This is going to allow us to essentially catch up a shadow from more or less anywhere we want, and then move on to it with Shadow Step. Obviously, if the enemy's relatively low health, we can do this to finish them off at 19 initiative. Otherwise, sometimes we'll try to use 46 to go after. This not having a late initiative is a little bit worse for this combo, but, I mean, you can't have it all. So this is the best use of Shadow Step at level 1, other than just doing an attack 3, or again, if you've already killed an enemy, you can just step onto the shadow with this top in that instance. Just being able to combo these two allows us to basically keep up a shadow while we also move, which is going to be a really important theme for this build, as you'll see, especially as we get into a couple levels. So Strength of the Abyss, this is the namesake. Obviously, this Persistent Loss on bottom would also be very good for the melee build, but we're going to primarily build around maximizing the effect of the top. Wave of Anguish, this is a great loss, but again, we're not going to want to move all of our shadows all the time. We're just going to care about a couple, or at least until later. Later, this loss has a little bit more synergy, but regardless, this bottom is actually just really good for us. So the range build doesn't like this bottom nearly as much as it likes this or this bottom, really, because it doesn't care so much about moving itself. We want more than anything to be able to move ourselves and shadows at the same time, which is sort of like the additional cost for playing the melee build, is that we have to both move ourselves and shadows, and typically our bottom actions do one or the other, but not both, or at least not both efficiently. So this is sort of the best shadow movement bottom for us. The downside, of course, is that it's only 2 movement here and it's only 1 movement here. So it's not great. Obviously, we want to do better than this, but that being said, it's still as good as we've got. Lingering Rot is actually one of the best arguments for the melee build as well. So we know from playing a Scoundrel that move 3, poison 1 adjacent enemy is just a great in-combat bottom action, and we, if we're willing to go into melee, get that here as well, which is a really big payoff for it. Top loss, not super important to us. Call of the Abyss is just an essential card for this class, doesn't really matter. We'll be using both the bottom and the top in this build. The bottom more so at lower levels. Eclipse, also both halves very good for this build. A move 4 much less important for the ranged build, who can just teleport to shadows. But in the melee build, a move 4 is actually quite important. And this top is actually going to let us become very powerful very quickly in scenarios early on in our campaign, which is something we're going to do quite often. And then Sunless Apparition, this is, again, not really what we're looking for. We don't really care about having the ability to teleport to shadows. We already have Forceful Spirits, which gives us a great top and the ability to teleport to shadows if we occasionally need it. So this is like 2 halves we want, whereas this, sure, we're going to be missing out on a loot, but bottom loot actions aren't very good anyway. And we're not really that interested in spending shadows to summon. I mean, we could, it would be fine. There's no real downside to having this opportunity, but all of our cards are pretty good and we have to cut something. So if we're looking at level 1, the cards we're going to cut are Rest in the Shade is a pretty easy cut, Black Barrage is probably the hardest cut, and Sunless Apparition. So this is going to be what our level 1 hand looks like on a melee Deathwalker. And I'll just quickly try to explain what I would typically do starting from level 1 when playing a melee Deathwalker. My first turn is almost always going to be Call of the Abyss bottom plus Eclipse top, just to place 4 shadows on the map, to then immediately next turn be able to do something like Lingering Rot bottom plus Strength of the Abyss top. This is what I want to do if I'm ever facing a difficult first room, is combine these 2 things. And then, again, if you're playing with, like, especially nerf stamina potions, you can use a minor stamina potion to get back 1 card, recur this, and then try to play this towards the end of the first rest cycle, because you do want to get this top set up for the rest of the scenario. You just don't really want to have to play it right away, because you'd rather get to 4 shadows, because that immediately puts this already at a non-loss attack 5. If the first room is not difficult, though, or if it's just like kind of medium difficulty, or our party is really good at dealing with like difficult situations to begin with, then I'm more likely to play this. So like this is like high pressure first room. I'm going to do this in this turn 1. Low to medium pressure first room. I'm going to look to do Call of the Abyss top turn 1 and Call of Doom bottom turn 1, just a great dark. And then I'm going to try to move and do Forceful Spirits top the following turn and start setting up shadows more slowly. You really will notice the difference between that. Between like when you do this or when you do this. Like you're going to feel so much more powerful right away, but obviously with a very real cost. We're giving up a move 4, which is a big deal for this build, and we're just playing a lost card just for a temporary power boost, essentially, because we'll always reach 5 shadows eventually on this build. And like I said, you will end up using Fluid Knight top at low levels, but you don't want to use it too much, so be careful. Because again, you really want to try to hover around 4+ shadows as much as possible. Obviously, once Strength of the Abyss gets down to being just an attack 4 or lower, it becomes a lot less impressive since we are a squishy melee character. The upside of being a melee Deathwalker is this at least attack 5 or higher. Okay, so that's what a level 1 build looks like for us. Level 2, our choice is pretty straightforward. Deepening Despair is obviously a fine card. Good for hybrid builds and stuff like that. For the melee build, Restless Spirits is everything we want. This already gives us another version of this like shadow movement on bottom compared to Dark Fog, although that's not really the most interesting part of this. It's actually more so the top, which is an attack 3 curse. So again, all right, let's grab this, bring it up here. So there's a lot of different applications of this. So first of all, it might seem like, oh wow, this is an attack 6 curse, that's insane. At level 2, it's very difficult to consistently do this effect. And let me show you why. So basically, if we move a shadow on a turn, we don't typically get to move ourselves on a turn, again, unless we're able to move to an enemy, which is essentially within 2 hexes of both ourself, well, 3 hexes of ourself and 2 hexes of shadow, which can happen, but isn't going to happen that often. So accordingly, to move a shadow a reasonable distance at low levels requires us to play one of, like, basically Dark Fog bottom, right? But if we're playing Dark Fog bottom, we're not also moving ourselves. So otherwise, then we would have to already be adjacent to an enemy from the previous turn, move the shadow underneath us, and then do this. There are certainly ways that we can do this. Again, we can try to do something like Dark Fog bottom plus Shadow Step top, potentially going late or killing off one enemy, except that we maybe take a hit and then the following turn do something like this. Again, it's basically just to say that don't expect to get this payoff all the time, or very frequently, even at low levels, but that's fine. Basically, this action is going to scale really well once we hit medium to high levels, and you'll see, I didn't mean that pun, but it actually works great, and you'll see why that is in a second as well. But yeah, even just as an attack 3 curse at 20 initiative, this is great, especially because, again, this gives us now nice initiative to pair with Lingering Rot. I can do a move 3 poison, and then do an attack 4 curse because of the poison at 20 initiative, which is just great. As a nice setup. The lower damage means that I'm most likely getting the curse. And again, this bottom is also often going to be a reasonable amount of time be useful as well, because moving a shadow 4 hexes is almost as good as Dark Fog bottom. And at the same time, we can sometimes use this to deal direct damage. So it might seem like an obvious replacement for Dark Fog. That being said, it's actually not the case, just because we really want to use Restless Spirits top, and we still want one of these effects. So we're actually going to cut here is just Fluid Night. Again, we really don't want to be using Fluid Night on this build. We don't want to be spending shadows. And again, while sometimes we're willing to do that, this is now, even if it's not a super realistic or super consistent way to spend shadows, the way we would prefer to spend shadows is the top of Restless Spirits now. So it's just pretty easy to cut Fluid Night at this point. Okay, moving on to level 3. Again, melee versus range. Pretty obvious choices here for which card we're going to take. Ritual Sacrifice is the second huge payoff for being in melee, right? I mean, well, technically third, because there's this as well. But, I mean, all right, so while this can get up to an attack 6 non-loss consistently while spending nothing, this can get up to an attack 8 non-loss while spending nothing. Now, that's not going to happen very often. More realistically, this is often going to hover around an attack 6-ish, sometimes being an attack 5, sometimes being an attack 7, and rarely being an attack 8. That's fine, though, right? Like, attack 6-ish non-loss at 13 initiative at level 3 is amazing. Now, the catch is, this is also not so easy to use at level 3, because again, it's not very easy for us to move ourselves to get into position to make these attacks, and to move shadows at the same time. Certainly can do it, requires a fair amount of setup. That's okay, it will get better. And again, even if just right away it just ends up a lot of times being an attack 4 or attack 5, that's still okay, because again, 13 initiative, attack 4/attack 5 is still going to be pretty good for us, which doesn't cost us anything. The bottom is also pretty good. Again, in the melee build, we're going to end up stockpiling more shadows because we have less things that spend shadows, or the things we have that spend shadows are going to be less consistent. So this is actually going to be a reasonable way to get some extra experience as one of the points, and also just sometimes we're going to need the shield to survive when we want to go somewhere, or we can make an ally survive. This just adds nice flexibility, and also is going to be easier to use early on than this. Gives us another bottom, which also creates dark, although again, we don't want to rely on this move plus dark very often, because we want to be looking to use Ritual Sacrifice top. The replacement here is pretty easy. Anger of the Dead was really just there for initiative. We weren't using this otherwise very much. Again, with the exception of occasionally for experience if we really desperately needed it, although that was kind of just at the end of the scenario, and now we have this, which serves that same function. So this is just very easy replacement to Anger of the Dead. Okay. Sorry, just gonna have a sip of water. Level 4, again, pretty easy choice here. The ability to create an extra shadow right away is actually really nice. Playing this bottom with Call the Abyss top turn 1 is a solid turn 1, even for the melee build. But again, this is just invaluable. This significantly mitigates probably the biggest drawback to the melee Deathwalker build, which is that we're a low HP, squishy character. So even though we're going to have a perk to give some disadvantage to enemies, that's not consistent enough to avoid dying. This is going to allow us 2 turns per rest cycle where we can more or less attack with impunity, which is a really, really, really big deal to this class. So pulled across is just, this is just essential. Like this is part of, so basically like, I don't know, at level 2 and 3, we got some sort of payoffs for the melee build, but we didn't make it any easier really to do the melee build stuff. You're going to get like more temptation, more like things drawing you into being like, man, I could do all this powerful stuff, but it's still kind of awkward for me. 4 and 5 are going to make it much, much less awkward. This in the sense of making it so that we don't take much damage, and then when we get at level 5, just making everything sing. So, pulled across is a really easy pick here. You can occasionally use the top loss, it's fine. And then it's just going to replace Call of Doom. I guess I can keep these in initiative order so that you can see our nice initiative spread. Put that there. Call of Doom obviously was just there for a move Great Dark. I don't care about Dark, or we don't really care about Dark that much at this point that we really need 2 instances of it. We really just have Forceful Spirits, which we're using Dark with consistently. So again, not a really big deal. And again, you can see that we have Eclipse still excellent on this class at this point. Even if as we level, our attack modifier deck gets better, it becomes easier for us and our party to kill 1 or a couple enemies quickly, so we're going to less frequently use the top of Eclipse. But Eclipse is still great, again, because of the move 4, and now that we have this, which puts us invisible, having a late initiative to go after the turn where we go invisible is what allows us to essentially be untouchable for 2 turns. So now this is even more incentive to not play the top of Eclipse because of how badly we want the bottom of Eclipse, because this we're always going to be playing as a loss early-ish in a scenario. Accordingly, if we play this as a loss and this is a loss now, our next lowest initiative after we play this is 64, which is pretty rough. So once you get pulled across, you're really going to want to try to save Eclipse a lot more frequently for the bottom action. Okay, on to level 5. So, level 5. I mean, Dominate's great, and this bottom is not bad, but Medium is... It's the oil in the gears, it's the drugs, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. This is the thing. And it might seem like the top is the thing, and don't get me wrong, the top is nice, and actually gets better once we get level 7. And you can certainly use the top for like maybe the first rest cycle, depending on the circumstances in the first room. But what you really want on this card is the bottom. So, up until now, we've had the tension where, again, we need to move and our shadows need to move, and these are both bottom actions. Having this persistent loss up on bottom allows us now to more or less just focus on moving ourselves, and our shadows will just always be where we want them to be because we move them earlier that turn. It's not perfect, and we still want a bit of shadow movement, but it is still so very good. Like, after you've played Melee Deathwalker with this, you'll really never want to go back. And that's not to say that it isn't reasonable to try to build around not doing this and doing this, but this is so convenient, and this is just going to immediately make Restless Spirits and Ritual Sacrifice so much more powerful, because again, now we move that Shadow 3 next to an enemy, which is so easy to do, and then now we have this Attack 6 Curse, or you've moved a couple Shadows next to an enemy over a couple turns, and now we're making our Attack 5, Attack 6, Attack 7s with Ritual Sacrifice. Again, this is just absolutely everything we want on a Melee Deathwalker, is the ability to just consistently move Shadows without needing to play bottom actions for it. It is so good, and again, the biggest shame is that we have to give up the top, but it's a price we're willing to pay because this really just does it all. So at this point, this goes in for Dark Fog. We just don't really have any reason to have this effect anymore now that we have this. We still have Restless Spirits if we ever need to move a Shadow a bit. So, and again, this is also just going to make Shadow Step so much better too. Like, it just makes everything better. And so now my most common turn 1 play on this class as a Melee Deathwalker is just going to be medium bottom, Call of the Abyss top, just set up all my persistence. Again, if the first room is very high tempo, maybe I can't get away with that, but that's what I really want to do, is just play this turn 1 and this turn 1. And again, we'll have a bit of a slower start, but that's okay. Because once we get going, we're really going to get going. And again, we still have reasonable things we can do with multiple attack 3, attack 4s, curses, and poison. Again, we can go invisible to make these attacks impunity. So it's going to start working pretty reasonably. All right, level 6, pretty easy choice again. I mean, not that easy, I guess. The truth is that Dominate is also just very, very good. And you could potentially take it, but this is just such a good bottom for this class. Again, 94 initiatives, everything we could ever want coming out of invisibility, giving us a bottom attack, which also can, when we need it to be, function as a teleport to a shadow. It's just great. And it's also a little bit of shadow movement when we need it. It's just like, I don't know, this has so many different tools that you're happy to have on this class. And again, because we have a move Poison, this can often be an attack 4 the following turn. Being able to make multiple attacks in a turn is also a really big deal because we can potentially kill 2 enemies in a turn, which can get us 2 shadows in a turn. This bottom is just really, really good. Occasionally, you can summon this top too. We don't really have non-loss top actions when moving from room to room on a melee Deathwalker, so being able to do this when moving from room to room, if you don't mind dropping down to 3 shadows, is certainly something you can do if it's not going to impact your stamina too much. I have summoned this a not insignificant amount of times, so it's also an option that's there, but we're primarily taking this for the bottom action here, which is just so good for us. So this is coming in now, and where is it? Forceful Spirits, and your time to shine is past. Forceful Spirits was obviously quite good at lower levels, but by level 6, this is becoming a little bit significantly more underwhelming. We can make much bigger attacks by this now, and because we now have this, we always really did want to keep 1 teleport to a shadow thing, just because you never know, but we really don't need 2 of them, so this just makes it so much easier to replace this, which had kind of been looking a little bit long in the tooth. Alright. So these all shift over, and the Night Takes Shape comes in. Alright, level 7. So level 7 gives us, again, kind of exactly what... If we could have had this much earlier, we might not have even taken a medium, although we still would have, and I will still usually play the bottom of medium. Although it depends on the scenario now, which is what's great about this. But yeah, this is everything you wanted in a bottom. Essentially, this at level 1, we had a move 2, move all shadows 1. Here we can have a move 2/4, move 2 shadows 4. And again, moving 2 shadows and moving all shadows, it's not the same, but it's pretty close. So this bottom is just so good for us. And again, we have a consistent source of dark that we're going to play every rest cycle, so it's very easy to use this after the dark. Downside, of course, is the initiative doesn't line up very well, which is also why we're going to start getting some dark attack modifiers, as you'll see when we go through the perks. The top is also fine. I really am only looking to play this top if I can actually consume dark to create a shadow here, which again, we can create dark, so it's not that difficult for us. Because obviously just getting a free shadow with this is good. I don't want to do this very often, but it is a disarm, and again, you don't always have that many. You're not always spending as many, or you're often not spending as many shadows as you're creating as a melee Deathwalker. So having this possibility to, like, I don't know, depending on facing some hard-hitting enemies or a boss or something like that, this is certainly a reasonable top to play occasionally. I'm not super interested in it, though, because this bottom is just really everything that I want. Okay, and so this is going to come in, and it is going to replace Wave of Anguish. Because again, this is just the upgraded version of Wave of Anguish. This is a very easy 1-for-1 replacement. Okay. Level 8. So level 8 gives us some interesting choices. Nothing that really, unlike basically all the levels up till now, nothing that really screams melee Deathwalker. So I don't really care too much about getting this persistent retaliate on myself. Like, yeah, I'm going to be occupying shadows most of the time, but 2 retaliate isn't really what I want. I'm going to be making big attacks anyway, and also I'm already looking to play 2 persistent losses pretty consistently. Like I said, now that we have Proliferation of the Abyss, we can consider not playing medium as a persistent loss, although I think once you get used to playing medium, you're not really going to want to live without it, although you can try. So yeah, this is not really what I want here. This is, again, more of like a support thing, depending if I have like a tank in the party and I'm playing a ranged Deathwalker, is where I'm looking more often to do this. So this bottom is obviously quite good. Moving 2 shadows, 3 hexes, and then dealing some direct damage. It's perfectly fine. But again, I don't really want bottoms which just move shadows and don't move me. That's not really what I want to be doing, because I need to be constantly moving myself as well. And we already now have medium and Proliferation of the Abyss, so shadow movement on bottom like this just isn't very appealing to us. This is much better for a ranged character. So we're just going to slam Frozen in Fear here. Now again, this is more of like a ranged ability, but that's still great. First of all, as a melee Deathwalker, we don't have any form of crowd control, right? Like, we just have none. We didn't take Dominate, so we have no stuns, no disarms, no immobilizes, not even any muddle or anything like that, although technically we have permanent disadvantage against us a lot of the time. So having access to some crowd control is actually really welcome. And again, because we have medium up, it's actually not difficult at all to put 1 shadow in a position where it can immobilize a bunch of enemies and prevent them from potentially attacking. We won't always get the dark here, but that's not such a big deal. Like, 2 damage and 3 damage, yeah, it is certainly different, and obviously if we can get the dark here, we'd like it. But it's not like... It's not making or breaking this card. The big part of this card is the Immobilize. And obviously, again, with medium plus Proliferation of the Abyss, we can move a shadow, Proliferation of the Abyss, we can move a shadow 7 hexes in a turn, so we can put really a shadow anywhere we want and immobilize a bunch of enemies adjacent to it, which makes this still very valuable and very flexible, in the sense that we also we can affect enemies not necessarily where we are. I know this seems more like a hybrid thing, but it's really just very good, so it just kind of comes at almost no cost. I forget what we wanted to cut for this at this point. I think it was typically Eclipse is what I'd be cutting here, because I've already got this as late initiative now. Yes, Eclipse is what I would cut at this point. Which, again, Eclipse has been very good for us. Having this move 4 is fine. But now we do have this, which is going to be a move 4 a lot of the time. We still have this to teleport to shadows at this point. We've got a move 2 and a move 3. So we're going to be consistently moving, and I guess a move 2 here as well. Not very often we're ever using this bottom. So we're going to be moving through scenarios pretty consistently. I don't feel like I have to have this move 4 anymore. Obviously, on long movement scenarios, you could consider bringing this. And again, we also have Shadow Step as a move 3 on top if we really need movement. So again, Eclipse was nice. Definitely not complaining about it, but something has to get cut. And I think this is the most reasonable now that we have the 94 to cover our initiatives. So, or to cover our late initiative after invis. Frozen Fear goes here, and it's just a great card. Speaking of great cards, it's time for the Capstone to our melee Deathwalker build, Black Lance, which is just absolutely insane. I mean, again, we were pretty excited to be doing non-loss attack 6s, 7s, stuff like that. Now we're just like very easily non-loss attack 10, non-loss attack 13. Again, not difficult to set this up to do very high values. When we have things like medium and proliferation of the abyss, right? Like with medium plus proliferation of the abyss, we can easily move 3 shadows into sort of a beautiful pathway to lead us towards an enemy. And obviously there are things like using boots or whatever to increase the movement. So yes, it is very consistent to get attack 10, attack 13 with this. Obviously it costs us removing shadows, but like I said, that's not such a big deal, especially because you're always killing the enemy with this, right? And for any time that you don't want to use this top, this bottom is just, I mean, it's also completely nutty. So this is everything we could ever want on a melee Deathwalker, and it is insane. And so something has to get cut here, and it's pretty easy to replace Shadow Step at this point. Shadow Step is still fine, but again, we just kind of need 1 instance of top move. We don't really need 2 that much, and then attack 3 isn't really where we want to be anymore. So yeah, pretty easy cut for Shadow Step. Black Lance comes in, and that is what a level 9 melee Deathwalker looks like. So this is our build all the way through to level 9, and let me tell you, it's glorious. All right, so let's move on over to perks. I can't really do items because, again, it depends on the context in which you're playing. Since we don't have public Frosthaven items, but if at this point you're playing this class in base Gloomhaven, then yeah, I mean, just use some Gloomhaven items. All right, so what are we going to do for perks? Well, we really, really want this perk, but I don't like taking this right away. The biggest reason for that is, again, at lower levels, it's harder to consistently occupy Hexes of Shadows, although this is still something I want very early. So typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this perk first, and then I'm going to take this perk second. Again, this is just like the most powerful AMD perk we have, and then this one gets rid of the -2 so that we consistently know that we'll draw at least a -1, which is just nice. Better for predictability, which is pretty important for a Deathwalker. And then I'm going to go back and get this. I know I'm probably still not, like I'm not at the medium point yet, but it's still not that difficult to trigger this a reasonable amount of the time. And for just a single check mark, this actually has pretty impressive amount of value. I mean, this is a big selling point for the melee Deathwalker. Then I'm going to go back after that and take these 3 remaining perks here so that I get all the negatives out of my deck. Again, very important for a Deathwalker because when I attack, I really want to be sure, all right, either I'm going to miss or this enemy's going to die. So that A, I'm not going to take like an attack back from the enemy afterwards, and B, so that I know I'll get a shadow. From there, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to ignore negative scenario effects. I think usually this is kind of similar to base Gloomhaven, the point at which we would do ignore negative scenario effects. Now that we have such a beautiful, clean deck, we really don't want some scenario effect to dump a bunch of junk into it. And then I'm going to go back for these. So this might seem a little unintuitive because you're like, well, but aren't these perks so good? And they are really, really good. Like this perk, I think, is probably an intrinsically stronger perk than this one. But the reason why I'm going to take this first of all, like I said, as we're getting to higher levels, we have gotten an additional source of dark consumption, right? Now we have Frozen Fear and Proliferation of the Abyss, which both want dark, and they're not always going to conveniently line up after Pulled Across. A lot of the times we're going to be using Pulled Across into Night Takes Shape, so we might not have the dark here. The other thing is that, again, on a ranged Deathwalker, we make more small attacks on multiple enemies, right? It's like more AoE focused, whereas us, we are all about one big hit per turn, right? And on big hits, Curse is just not very valuable because if we kill the enemy, we're not getting Curse. Accordingly, I don't really value this as highly on a melee Deathwalker as on a ranged Deathwalker, and I value this higher. The reason being that this is mathematically going to add more damage to our deck at this point. It's like 0.7 here and 0.5 here, I think, is the difference. Let me just double check. I actually did the math just before this. Yeah. That is, so this to 6. Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, this is, 0.05 damage per attack, and this is adding 0.07 damage per attack, while also having a more useful added effect, right? Because I would rather have Dark than a Curse on an enemy that's going to die. Now, obviously, if the enemy's not dying, the Curse is better, but because of the values that we consistently attack for, the Curse is much less likely to be a useful added effect for us, which is kind of the same reason I'm not super interested in this Disarm, because we're going to just be not one-shotting, but we're going to just become, we're the finisher, right? We're just coming in and cleaning enemies out one by one. Our allies send them up, we knock them down. So that's why things like this and this aren't as valuable to me, and I actually prefer taking this here. And then after that, I'm going to go back and take this perk here, which is whenever you short rest, you may consume dark to perform curse range 2. Again, we're not always going to want to use the pulled across dark for something else, for one of our other actions. And on top of that, we have some more free sources of dark at this point. So some free curses over the course of a scenario are really nice. Also, again, this can interact very favorably against some of the most annoying enemies in Gloomhaven or potentially Frosthaven. So this is the first 10 perks that I would take. From there, I don't know. I mean, from there, I'd probably go back and take these. And then, I don't know. I mean, you could also consider taking this a little bit sooner. I don't think that this is very valuable on this on a melee Deathwalker just because you're going to have medium anyway. But obviously, it's okay. If your allies really need healing, you can take this. I think from there, it's kind of like flex dealer's choice, more or less. But this is the order in which I would take my first 10 perks, typically, on a melee Deathwalker. Okay, so I think that more or less covers everything. We've gone over how I would build the cards from levels 1 through 9, and the perks that I would take. Again, items I can't really say, but that's more or less it. So I hope this helped, and see you again soon.